Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Center on National Security at Fordham's Law's first event for the semester. And it's the first of many events, and this one is particularly exciting. We're here today to talk about something we've talked a lot about in the past, the Department of Justice. Where does it come from? What's it look like today? And what might it look like tomorrow? My name is Karen Greenberg. I'm the director of the Center on National Security here at Fordham. And this event is on the record and is being broadcast on C-SPAN as well. We will take questions, but you can feel free to send them in as you like. And if we have time and there's time in the conversation, we will bring your questions up. So let me introduce our wonderful panelists, all of whom have a wealth of knowledge about the Department of Justice for one reason or another. First, Joshua Larocca, Senior Managing Director of Stroz, Friedberg and Aon Company, and formerly a trial attorney in the counterterrorism section at the DOJ. And I want to mention a Fordham Law grad. Joshua Geltzer is also with us. He is the Executive Director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. We call that ICAP, right? And a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. He previously served in several positions as the Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council, as Deputy Legal Advisor to the NSC, and as Counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security. And finally with us also is David Rohde, Executive Editor of NewYorker.com and Pulitzer Prize-winning author. His recent book is In Deep, the F.B.I., the C.I.A., and the Truth About America's Deep State. And lately, he's been writing about many things, including Barr and the DOJ. So welcome to all of you. Let's get started. Today, Washington and the country seem embroiled in controversy and chaos. And it seems very much that the Department of Justice are in the headlines about all of what's going on in the country. If it's not the protests in Portland or in Kenosha, if it's not issues about COVID and restrictions and whether they should be followed or not, if it's not about the election and concerns about the legality of the election and the procedures for the election, not to mention a number of cases that involve administration officials and the DOJ's role as those cases go through the system. So I think we have a lot to talk about today, and I want to start with the big question. And the big question is, does this really look different to you? Does it look like a different environment than when you, for example, the two of you were at the Department of Justice, or are we just overreacting? And let's begin with you because you were there the longest time ago, Joshua Larocca, so you can give us some recent history.
And I have the gray hairs. Thanks, Karen, it's good to be here. I thought I would start with, to your question of, sort of what has the department looked like, and we're talking about national security today. In particular, and sort of what does it look like over the last number of years and bringing us up to the present moment. And in getting ready for today's conversation, I decided to go and look at sort of the recent press releases and the recent announcements on recent cases, and just sort of see what's being publicly announced and so forth. And what I saw, and I went back to let's say the beginning of August, end of July. And, again, grounding this conversation in national security, I saw any number of cases in the national security realm that could have, that you could have taken the same snapshot from 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I saw a material support case or an attempted material support case about ISIS, one about Al-Qaeda, some very interesting cases involving the cyber threat and the takedown of cryptocurrency accounts related to certain foreign terrorist organizations and so forth. So in that snapshot, on the one hand, you can say that the steady stream of national security prosecutions that have been really in place in one form or the other since September 11th, and maybe really sort of picked up steam with the founding of the National Security Division in 2006, remains consistent. And I think, and I've thought for a long time, that the general public who doesn't follow these types of issues on a day-to-day basis would generally be surprised to find that these cases are happening with some regularity. And that if you said, in August there was an AQ case or an ISIS case or what have you. And so I think on that level, there's been a remarkable degree of consistency. And I think, so that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is you then have to place that in the context of how do you, place, let's say, those cases and what's happening on the day-to-day line level with the larger context. And to use a phrase from David's book, right, what's the difference between the institutional government and the political class? Or the political set of factors that weigh in on any administration. And I think that's the interesting, dividing line, if you will, that I think we're going to get into today.
So do you think that the national security, just following up, do you think that the National Security Division established in 2006, as you say, is sort of what's true for them is true for the other departments of the Department of Justice, or not?
Well, again, I mean, if you extrapolate out, again, there is a steady stream of what I would call, regular bread and butter cases that are being brought across the department, right? And of course, DOJ, as everyone is well aware, unlike a lot of other executive branch agencies, right, has this dichotomy between, the institution of main justice and individually appointed U.S. attorneys, separately presidentially appointed and confirmed, of course, in the districts around the country. And again, I think there is just a tremendous amount of that work that just goes on day to day.
So Joshua Geltzer, let's bring you in on this. Your experience is more recent, having worked for the Obama administration. And I'm just wondering how you see this, and particularly talk about the Department of Justice in the whole, but also, if you like, the NSD. And I'm curious, because the amount of terrorism cases that Joshua Larocca is referring to are down in numbers and have been since the end of the Obama administration, largely because of the defeat of the caliphate and a number of other reasons. What is the National Security Division doing these days? And did some of the politically charged issues like Black Lives Matter protests and the threat of suits to get them, is that in the National Security Division or is that elsewhere?
Well, first, let me echo Josh and thanking you, Karen, and really thanking everybody who helped set this up. It's a pleasure to be doing this with David and Josh and Karen and to be tackling such an important issue. And, to maybe make a comparison and build on what Josh said, when people ask, is the Supreme Court very divided or polarized? You sometimes hear people say, look, there are actually a lot of cases that are unanimous and nearly unanimous that the public doesn't notice. And that to me feels like the comparison to what Josh is rightly calling our attention to. Prosecutions and other matters done primarily by career officials that are roughly continuing apace, at least in the national security space. Maybe not in the voting rights section, maybe not the environmental folks, but in the national security space. But then what people say about the Supreme Court is there are some really high profile cases that are quite polarized. And those cases also happen to matter a lot. And again, I think the analogy holds up here because there are some high profile cases that are being handled very, very unusually right now. And they matter a lot. And so let me zoom in and just give one, it might seem like not a big moment, and yet it reveals just how disruptive I think that political leadership of the Justice Department is to norms and traditions. Folks may recall when the Inspector General of the Justice Department, Michael Horowitz, issued his long-awaited, and in fact just plain long, report on the origins of the Russia investigation, for lack of a better way to simplify what he had looked into. And he found that there was no political taint or bias to the opening of that investigation, though he did identify problems with the FISA process at a more granular level. And within hours of it being issued, John Durham, prosecutor in the Justice Department, longtime prosecutor in fact, issued a statement saying he disagreed with Horowitz's conclusions and that his own investigation might yield something quite different. Now, again, that might just seem like a few sentences. It was just a few sentences. It was also completely wild that a prosecutor would do two things. One, disagree with the work of his own department's inspector general that had just been issued with pages and pages to back it up after months of investigation. Wild. Second, that he would comment on what might come out of his own ongoing investigation while that investigation was still occurring. Wild. And I would say not just wild, but inappropriate. Now, the Durham investigation is just a piece of what the Justice Department is doing right now, to go back to Josh and his helpful effort to situate us in all this. At the same time, the things that are under that political magnifying glass, they do seem to me to be handled very differently right now from how we used to see them handled, and frankly, how I think we'd like to see them handled.
David, part of what your recent book focuses on is the long-term scope. And you do talk a little bit about changes from one administration to another, and cases where there were politicized issues inside the Department of Justice, and then there was sort of a recalibration afterwards. Do you want to put this in perspective for us and how you see it, given your knowledge of the history of the department?
So I want to thank you as well for setting this up, and I joined both Joshes, who both know much more than I do about the Justice Department. History-wise, and thank you, Josh Larocca, for the institutional government plug. We can talk more. I spent a lot of time on that phrase. But anyway, I'm a nerd. Let me just get that out there. The book, and I think that in this, I didn't know that much about the Justice Department. I had sort of worked more overseas as a journalist, so the key thing for me is sort of understanding the modern Justice Department, and you understand it through the example of John Mitchell, Richard Nixon's Attorney General, who used his office to investigate Vietnam War protesters, Black Panthers and other groups, as a way to reinforce President Nixon's messaging about chaos in the country and the need for law and order. To be fair to Mitchell, he left his post as Attorney General, and then famously, chaired President Nixon's reelection campaign, and ended up going to jail for his actions as the chair of Nixon's campaign. But, you had these massive reforms in the late 70s. The Church Committee got into some of this and others. And you had President Ford appoint Edward Levy as Attorney General. You know him. Many people, I think, love him. President of the University of Chicago. Many people, watching might know this already, but he created this idea that the Attorney General, should carry out, justice programs and law enforcement priorities that the president asks to do. So Barack Obama wants a crackdown on environmental, or voting rights, let's say, violations. Another president, if President Trump wants to crack down on crime, that's his right. He is a democratically elected president. But the difference is if, the president wants to crack down on pharmaceutical companies, he can say that to the Attorney General, but it shouldn't be, Mr. Attorney General, go after this certain pharmaceutical CEO because he didn't give me a campaign donation. I mean, all this is old to you, but it helped me understand the modern Justice Department, the modern Attorney General. Edward Levy embodied it. We can talk more about the ups and downs that, from Ed Meese, on through Bill Barr. But this is the idea, and the point is to have people trust the politically neutral enforcement of the law. And I do think that is being questioned. But I agree with Josh Larocca. I mean, I think the institution is functioning. Dangerous, people are being prosecuted across the country. And people shouldn't overreact to the headlines about what is happening. But I think the department's being used in a way to aid a president's political goals and reelection effort in a way it hasn't been used since Watergate.
That's really interesting. So are you all kind of making a distinction between the DOJ on the one hand and the Office of the Attorney General on the other hand? That you can sort of separate them and assess them separately?
I think this Attorney General is making that more of a distinction than we're accustomed to seeing. I mean, we're having this conversation just hours after the Attorney General gave yet another interview. And again, Attorney Generals sometimes give interviews, they sometimes speak, but to do so in the way that this Attorney General does, where he deliberately replicates words chosen by the president, whether that's how he describes the Russia investigation of 2016, whether that's how he talks about mail-in ballots, despite telling under oath Congress that he had no evidence to support his characterization, and again saying that on national TV last night. When he creates his mouthpiece as something as prominent as it is, and as allied with the president as it is, I think it's the Attorney General who makes that office and really just that person, at least in some ways, distinguishable from the department, at least to a greater degree than we would have been accustomed to seeing in the past.
Yeah, Larocca, let me ask you to weigh in here because, you know, there have been attorney generals in the past that have been very close to the presidents. I mean, John F. Kennedy had his brother as his attorney general. So it's not just closeness in and of itself that matters, it's also the office. But just following up here, is there a distinction to be made? And, you know, in the past, and maybe David can talk about this afterwards, there have been suggestions that the Attorney General role really should, and the Department of Justice role really should be separated out as a truly independent entity. What are your thoughts?
Let me try to answer that in the context of again, the lens of national security. And I think one of the challenges when you talk about national security, of course, is it's in some ways a more subjective area than other areas of the law, right? I mean, if you talk about certain types of violent crime, you know, homicide, of course, you know, typically prosecuted at the state level, there's not a lot of debate around homicide. I mean, there's certainly debate around homicide and punishment and things, but not in the way that national security is, because the national security priorities of the country are always changing, right? And I think there are a variety of components that go into that, right? So when you talk about national security, you have to talk about the threat. What is the nature of the threat? The threat landscape, of course, has changed dramatically, is always changing dramatically. Cyber, which is an area that I work in a lot, is probably the biggest headline, right, in terms of the changing nature of the threat. And so when you say, okay, you know, what do prosecutions look like? What are the enforcement priorities of the department look like at any given time, right? There are always prosecutorial choices being made, right? And in the national security arena, if you start with, okay, what are the national security priorities of the country, and then how do you protect them, take enforcement actions and so forth, that is going to change over time. The example that I would use, right, in terms of saying what parts of the institution are consistent and what parts of the institution are dynamic, let's say, across administrations, I think the sanctions regime is a very good example. Enhanced sanctions, or the increased use of sanctions, is a well-told story at this point. Since September 11th, even though sanctions have been in place for a variety of reasons and under different regimes before September 11th. But the expanded use of sanctions has been sort of moving in one direction under various administrations for quite some time now. Okay, so you have that line happening. But then you have choices, obviously, that are being made by different administrations at different levels about, okay, well, who will be sanctioned and for what purpose, right? And the sanctions regime, I think, as everyone knows, is incredibly complex, very dynamic, changes almost on a day-to-day basis, right? If you're, for example, on the bank side trying to keep up with who you're trying to keep out of the US financial system. So that's where I think, right, on the one hand, I like the sanctions example because on the one hand, you see consistency, right? It's a tool that's been used by, you know, again, lots of different types of administrations. But on the other hand, you're making strategic choices about who's going to be sanctioned and when and for what purpose.
Well, one of the questions that come to us, and I'm just going to bring them up, it fits perfectly into this conversation, is, and it's from Johnny Dwyer, is, you know, is the nature of national security changing? The definition of national security changing? We hear these days about the protests themselves being national security concerns of major importance. Judge Geltzer, what do you think about that? Do we need a rethink in terms of the division, the National Security Division, and has its portfolio become broader, and is it focusing domestically in ways it hasn't before, or how do we think about this?
It's a great question from Johnny, who's written great stuff on some of these issues, and it really picks up just where Josh left off, which is the recognition that it's not that there's a set of cases that is obvious and objective that any Justice Department simply needs to pick up and do and pick up and do. Instead, there are policy choices, there are leadership choices about where to try to find cases in the first place, or as Josh says, where to use an established tool, but how to direct it. And the Justice Department is ultimately not just a place that churns out law, but that also makes policy choices. In fact, the National Security Division was created in part to enhance the Justice Department's policy role, policy voice in the interagency process. So I think these are choices, and it's incumbent on the National Security Division amidst the broader Justice Department to keep up. When I had the pleasure of working there, folks like Lisa Monaco, John Carlin, Mary McCord made sure that the division, while never taking its eye off the terrorist threat, realized the cyber thing was getting bigger and more important and more consequential. And Josh is the real cyber expert in this crew, but that's an important pivot to make. That's important expertise to bring in. That changes whom you hire. That changes what sort of partnerships you forge with what parts of the FBI. That changes how you work with U.S. attorneys' offices and where you hope they build up expertise. So that evolution needs to happen. And Johnny's put his finger on what I think needs to be a big part of that evolution, which is dealing with this surging domestic terrorist threat, or I tend to call it white supremacist terrorist threat, because it has increasingly transnational links. It's not just domestic, unfortunately, it's global. And we've seen a little bit of innovation on that front. I want to give credit where it's due. We saw the FBI and the broader Justice Department disrupt a plot in Colorado that DOJ and FBI said was the first, at least public, manifestation of new cooperation between the counterterrorism investigators and the hate crimes investigators. And we can talk about this more, but those are people who use different tools and tend to come at things differently. And domestic terrorism in some ways slices between them a bit. And so there was adaptation. There was a new collaboration in which that which hate crimes investigators know to look for, and the tools that counterterrorism folks tend to use, tools that are often focused on stopping a crime or catching someone when they've committed a crime without people getting hurt, bringing that together in a useful way, in a way that may well have saved lives. I think more is needed, and I think that this Justice Department overall has not made that pivot towards addressing the rising white supremacist threat as much as it could and should have. But I do think you see some indications of that sort of adaptation, and that needs to be an ongoing process as threats evolve.
You know, one of the things I think, if you just said to the normal educated, reader of the media, what are the national security concerns that the Department of Justice is involved in right now, would mention the Durham investigation. And the Durham investigation has really, into the origins of the Russia investigation, is that how you put it, Joshua? I think thinking about how that's been handled, there's a real question now of what the political dimension of it is. And there's been, I guess, Attorney General Barr has refused to say that he won't release the report prior to the election, when it's sort of longstanding policy that up to 60 days, within 60 days of an election, Justice Department doesn't release things or, that could affect a political election. Have you thought about this, David? And just, do you have a sense of how the Durham investigation has brought a spotlight onto the Department of Justice, and maybe that's unfair?
It has, and I guess that we're talking about hate crimes, and earlier, it's how do you define a terrorist? How do you define a national security threat? And that can be a political thing. The president is talking about these protests in terms of Antifa, and that's the threat to security. And then, so my revolutionary is your terrorist, so to speak. And the Justice Department is in a very difficult position of deciding, who's a criminal, and who's, pushing for change. But in terms of the Durham investigation, it is surprising that Barr won't rule out, announcing the what they're going to find before the election. That would be a clear effort to boost the president's re-election chances. Josh Geltzer talked about, Trump, talked about Barr in the interview last night, talking about the, voting and voter fraud. And what's amazing is the kind of power of the Justice Department, in so many realms, whether it's, who's in a hate group and who's a legitimate political movement, what's a legitimate election and what's not. I think, and I'm sorry to meander, but you all mentioned digital. I've talked to Senator Mark Warner. Like, as a nation, the media is at fault here too. We have no rules of the road for the digital age. Everything from hate speech to disinformation to monopolies. That's back to the Justice Department, the antitrust, division. So I think it's vital for the institution to not be seen as being so political, but it's also an extraordinarily challenging time for the Justice Department, if that makes sense. And it'll be, even if Biden is elected, this is a very difficult time to navigate.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that before we go. But we have a question that just builds on what we're talking about from Matt Olson, which is, what are the implications for the National Security Division of the fact that the AG has turned to other DOJ prosecutors like Durham to conduct investigations that are within the purview of NSD? And I see you nodding like you want to answer it, Josh Geltzer, so go for it.
Well, what I really like to do is to get Matt to answer his own question, because he will have more thoughts than the rest of us combined on this area. But it strikes me as there are two things worth saying about it. One is, I think it adds to the sense that Barr wants a look not situated in an understanding of how these sorts of investigations tend to get opened, what the purpose was, even the fact that they seem to be interviewing people in the intelligence community, potentially at the level of line analysts, as if somehow providing an assessment of counterintelligence is a threat. All of this suggests a real desire to upend how things are done properly, rather than grapple with how they are normally done. The other thing is, this Justice Department is having to work to find people to carry out its will. I think here about when the president seemed like he wanted to take another run at adding a citizenship question to the census after the Supreme Court knocked down his first attempt. And they had to go collecting volunteers from across the department who'd be even willing to try defending something like that before eventually they backed down. So it all speaks to, again, in some high profile cases, some very, very unusual approaches right now.
You know, speaking of high profile cases, there was a decision yesterday in the Ninth Circuit, which went as close as you can to declaring Section 215, the surveillance, warrantless surveillance authority, unconstitutional. What do you think about that? I mean, I thought 215 was in the past. What's happening with that? Josh Larocca?
I'm just going to defer for 1 second to Josh Geltzer on that, if you don't mind, Karen.
Okay.
No, I'm going to confess that I saw that the Ninth Circuit handed down this lengthy opinion just yesterday. I think Judge Berzon wrote it, and it does feel like a blast from the past, talking about the telephone, bulk telephone metadata program. Obviously, such things are still alive to the extent that things collected then, even under a program that's been radically reoriented since. Indeed, the statute has been changed. But if it's being used used in a case in active litigation, the issue still remains. But I want to sit down and read that lengthy opinion and see what it was. I gather the Ninth Circuit said that this prosecution wouldn't be affected by it, but at least cast doubt on the legality of the program itself.
But it also came, you know, on the heels of, unrelated, these two announcements about Fisa Reform that Attorney General Barr has put out, which are actually very interesting. Did any of you get a chance to look at those?
I did not look at them in great detail, but I wanted to say that I think that it's important for us to realize how little people trust these surveillance programs, how little they trust the National Security Division. This gets back to problems that go beyond the kind of Trump-Biden dynamic. And so I think there is a problem with the FISA process. It's not transparent enough. I'm speaking, you know, as a journalist. People don't trust me either. Like I'm the very definition of a mainstream journalist for the New York Times.
I trust you, David. I just want you to know that I trust you.
But you know, writing this book, I met lots of committed public servants who put incredible amounts of time into these FISA applications. You know, but what happened with the FBI lawyer, Kleinsmith, if I'm remembering his name, Kevin Kleinsmith, you know, that's outrageous. And I think there is a need for the NSD to look at that, and the FISA court itself being seen as sort of a rubber stamp back to Edward Snowden's leaks, you know, and that's a challenge for the institution. So the ruling yesterday will just, I think, play into this, you know, as I've written in the book, like these fears of improper government surveillance of a big brother government that's everywhere, of a deep state that's, you know, victimizing ordinary Americans.
Well, what are we to make of the way in which the Flynn case has become sort of a football that's being passed back and forth. That's also the kind of thing where I think people are confused, right? They look at, you can interfere with a case, and you can just tell a case to be dropped and tell a judge what to do. That seems to many people, when you talk about trust, to violate certain ways in which we expect our courts to operate. Is that incorrect?
I'll jump in there, Karen. I mean, I think that, stepping back a second from the Flynn case, right? There are lots of interesting questions, from very small criminal cases to very big criminal cases, about what is in the discretion of the prosecution versus what the court can weigh in on, right? And plea deals, for example, are sort of rife with this sort of difficulty when it comes to, again, if an agreement is reached between a prosecutor and a defendant, and it's brought before a court, is the court obligated to accept that, right? And there are different regimes within different systems in this country, right? So the federal system, for example, works differently than where I started in New York in the Manhattan DA's office, in terms of how judges look at deals and pleas and arrangements that are made between prosecutors and defense counsel on behalf of their clients, right? In the federal system, you have these 11C1C pleas. Then there's the question of, is the court obligated to impose that sentence as it's presented to them, versus you plead guilty and the court will impose the sentence that it deems appropriate or in alignment with the guidelines, right? So there are different, I would just say there are different regimes for thinking about this that sometimes don't have a clear-cut answer.
So with the Flynn case, is there a clear-cut answer, or you think that's also something that would fit into what you're describing as a more normal back and forth that we don't maybe not understand as the public?
I mean, I don't know, I don't put a word on it, normal or not. I would just say I don't think it's cut and dry in terms of the considerations. Those types of considerations happen all of the time, I think, in terms of
so what you're saying is we're seeing a window into our Department of Justice that maybe we should have a little more knowledge all around about what goes on in the Department of Justice. Because for me, I'll put you a word on it, I'm extremely uncomfortable with the interventions in the Flynn case. And I think a lot of people are. And so is that, and I think of it as an outlier, not as the normal course of events. Josh Geltzer, do you have a sense of that?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish what a court might do, which is fraught with all sorts of hard questions. In fact, Judge Sullivan someday, and he's scheduled a hearing to move forward, will have to confront exactly the hard questions that Josh is describing so well. And that's one set of questions for the judge. What happens in the Justice Department, this strikes me as very worrisome. I guess I'm close to you on this, Karen, insofar as this is somebody who pleaded guilty twice, as it were, and for whom the justification offered by the Justice Department for abruptly dropping the charges before sentencing, I've never seen it in any other case. I don't think this Justice Department or any other future one is going to apply it to many other cases. The idea that somehow the materiality element was missing for the lies that Flynn told to the FBI agents who were asking him questions, it seems taken out of thin air, and it seems like a ride for one day only. And that's not what justice should be. Should not be one day only, should not be one defendant only. And the interventions in these cases, they don't seem to be happening coincidentally or randomly. They seem to be happening Stone, seem to be happening to Flynn. They seem to be happening to people who are personal friends, personal associates of, indeed, who may know damning things about the president. And I think there's every reason to worry about that, even if all those hard questions for what the judge should do, now that this uncomfortable situation is foisted upon him, remain. But at a minimum, personally, the idea that he might hold a hearing, as he intends to, and have the benefit of thinking through those hard questions with the briefing of the amicus he appointed, that strikes me as well within what the federal rules contemplate. And of course, that's what the DC Circuit and Bank, in a sense, said, that there was not at least the high bar for them to intervene and shut that down before it even happened had not been met by Flynn, supported by the Barr Justice Department.
So it delayed what needed to happen in a way that sort of represents the judge being able to do what he is empowered to do. Ultimately.
At least ask questions. At least, yeah. Because the federal, not to get too deep into the Flynn case, but the federal rule says that a court can dismiss charges with leave of court. And so that raises the question of, well, if they're going to be something, if a federal judge means something other than a rubber stamp, at a minimum, they might ask the Justice Department lawyers questions like, why? Yeah. And what led to this conversation? In particular, I don't just mean what theory of materiality is being offered up in the papers filed in the court to justify it. What led to this behind the scenes? I mean, that's, in a sense, what the Stone case is all about. And just again, to go back to things that Attorney General Barr has been saying, he got quite heated in his recent testimony before Congress on the change in sentencing recommendation under his watch at the last minute in the Roger Stone case. And he got quite animated saying, look, the judge ultimately landed in the range we recommended. How could I have done anything wrong? And that to me is a fundamentally wrong view of what the rest of us think has gone awry under Barr at the Justice Department. Because the question isn't, did the judge settle on a number that happened to fall into the same range you recommended? The question is, why did you change? And if the answer is because this is somebody whom we all know the president wanted us to go easy on, that's not equal justice under law.
Which kind of raises the elephant in the room, which is the elections. These elections are coming up 2 months from today. You referred to Barr's interview yesterday with Wolf Blitzer, in which he said he didn't know if it was legal or not to vote twice or something of that sort. And I think everybody was a little taken aback. But it made people wonder why he said it. In other words, what was the purpose of saying it? And David, I wondered if you, and I know you have, given some thought to what the challenges between the Department of Justice as it's currently playing itself out and what we're seeing and the election. And I want to go further than that. I'm going to ask the others of you to answer this. Is there a way for the Department of Justice to actually help make people relax and trust in the election process? So first, David, to you, do you think this is a problem? The trust in the election coming up and what Barr said yesterday, et cetera?
I think there's a huge problem with what he said yesterday, and that is that he's increasing people's distrust and anxiety about the vote counts and inflating the chances of fraud. That specific answer, though, that where he said, well, maybe you can vote twice, I think that's the moment we've all seen throughout the Trump years, which was a cabinet member fearing, publicly disagreeing with the president. We saw it with Dan Coates in intelligence hearings. And so I think he knows obviously that you can't vote twice, but that the president, again, I'm going to be very negative about the president here for a minute, but he has created a situation where, the top law enforcement official in the country, the top intelligence chiefs, are afraid of contradicting him in public. And that's extraordinary. The intelligence chiefs aren't even giving testimony to do that. So I think the other way that the Justice Department can help or hurt is this dispatch of federal agents, as we saw in Portland. That clearly Trump wants to do this. This is where, again, Barr helped him rhetorically, talking about dominating the streets and law and order. And Barr in the initial days after George Floyd's murder, talking about Antifa and how they were, deeply involved in all these protests, and they virtually had no cases involving Antifa. So Josh can talk about this better. The institution should be reassuring and calming the American public that, it could take weeks for this election to be decided, that, that the judicial system will work, have confidence in it, give it time. Don't rush it. And Barr isn't, doing that. He's doing the opposite, and that's what's so concerning about the situation.
Josh Larocca, are there ways that the Department of Justice can do what David said and sort of calm things down and provide a reassuring role, or they should stay out of it completely?
Well, I mean, I would sort of go back to, sort of where I started, which is that there is lots of good work that gets done on an institutional basis by career professionals. And there's been a long history, again, in this country of folks of all stripes praising career officials. It's interesting if you look at just any particular news story about a prosecution, national security or otherwise, you typically don't see, I would ask David for his perspective on this, you typically don't see the article cite the names of the prosecutors, right? It's just prosecutors from this office or this district brought this case. The defendants typically named and the charges and so forth. But the prosecutors are almost nameless, right? And that to me is where you derive faith in your institutions of government, right? It's that it's not me or it's not someone else. It's that the institution itself brought charges. They were upheld in a court, if there was a jury trial and so on. And so those are the things I think that mean something sort of for reaffirming the institutions that matter.
Well, Josh Geltzer, turning to you, you get the hard questions. I don't know how this happens. Josh Larocca is pointing to the fact, which I hadn't meant to bring into this conversation, that there could be litigation after this election on a whole bunch of levels, both in terms of how the voting works, how the voting booths work, what the disinformation is, that who knows, cyber issues. What do you foresee there, and how do you think this should be handled? Should it be handled within the Justice Department in some kind of special, whatever, administrative body that's set up, judicial? What do you think?
I think the Justice Department should stay out of that. In fact, there is current Justice Department policy not to get involved in any sort of election resolution issues, because resolving an election inevitably means weighing in on one side or the other, whether it's directly or whether it's indirectly, just by the position adopted. And instead, it's the less formal tools that this Justice Department seems to be using to put a thumb on the scale. It's not that they're actively filing briefs in support of Trump campaign litigation against drop boxes or against mail-in voting. I mean, that would be just abysmal if it were happening, but it is not happening and it shouldn't happen. And one hopes that it won't happen. But that doesn't change the fact that the things that are being said about whether there is some reason to worry about the legitimacy of an election if mail-in ballots have been used in higher numbers for it, that does its own damage. And that's part of what's interesting about this particular attorney general. It's not just the positions taken in court, it's that bully pulpit, that mouthpiece function that is maybe more political even than a lot of what the Justice Department itself is doing day in and day out, working their actual cases or enforcement actions or the other things that they do. But I do think that notion of what's being said, how it lines up with what the president as a candidate is saying, and then whether things like the Durham Report are timed and designed to influence how people think about the election. Even the fact that we're referring to a Durham Report. Why is there a Durham Report? He's an investigator. He appears to have contributed to one set of charges, the ones David mentioned earlier as having been brought against an F.B.I. lawyer. If he has other charges, those should be brought. Why is there a Durham Report? Inspector General put out a report covering much of the same territory. We shouldn't even normalize the notion that this is something in which a report is a typical last step, not to mention that Barr's apparent interpretation of the 60-day, admittedly more norm than policy, and this is something David's wonderful book, Deep State, talks about, how much is in the realm of norms rather than laws or policy. But this norm of not doing things in that last 60-day window, it seems from Barr's comments here and there that he regards that basically as bringing charges against a candidate. Whereas I would have thought most of us would have thought about that as doing things to help or hurt a candidate. And those have very, very different scopes. That's where I see this Justice Department potentially intersecting with the campaigns, with the election in the coming months.
If there were any, forgetting what's going to happen in the election, if there were some structural change that could be made to sort of stop the sense of politicization of a variety of acts of the Attorney General or of the Department of Justice in a larger sense, can you recommend any? Like if Congress said to you, or if the powers that be said we're going to reorganize things to make the optics, if nothing else, look better, what would be the structural change that should be made?
Can I speak as the pie in the sky journalist here? I think in a way, the Attorney General doing interviews is good. And I would say as a sort of an outsider, more interactions with the public, more interactions with the press for the National Security Division. If the FISA court could be more open. And and this is where now I won't criticize Trump. We are facing, the largest crisis of legitimacy, for the Justice Department, I think, since Watergate. But it began, Trump is taking advantage of the suspicions that are there. In the Stone case, he talked about the forewoman in the jury being a Democrat, she's being biased. I mean, from my reporting, the president doesn't believe that nonpartisan public service exists. He doesn't believe that journalists try to write stories that are sort of down the middle. And I'll describe this a little more, but I think many Americans sort of agree with him, and it's vital for us, to face that. And that, he thinks, there's career civil service in the Justice Department, but they like some presidents better than others, and they work harder for others. He thinks, everybody's kind of self-serving and puts spin on the ball. This is a little bit of his, coming out of the New York real estate world, and that's hurtful. It frustrates me as a journalist that we're all just sort of making things up to try to make ourselves famous. I'm sure it is infuriating to career prosecutors and civil servants, but there's a lot of Americans who've always thought that, and he's sort of voicing it. So I don't have great recommendations here, but I think we are overclassifying. Things are kept generally too secret. And I agree with Josh Larocca, like we should be writing those prosecutors. I've covered, I don't know, Josh, we might have been in an elevator at 100 Center Street in Manhattan together. I covered, Robert Morgenthau, the DA in New York City. So I'm biased as a journalist, but I think the public, more interviews by the prosecutors in these cases, by the U.S. attorneys in these cases, more transparency would help. And this is a problem that goes beyond Donald Trump's rhetoric. People don't trust the press. Me too, I'm guilty. They don't trust the Justice Department, and particularly the National Security Division.
So that's, Josh Larocca, what do you think? Do you think that the National Security Division, given that a large part of what it does involves classified issues, national security issues, classified information, is there a way to make it more transparent, or is that just a pipe dream on David's part?
I don't think it's a pipe dream at all. We're in 2020. We're 14 years into the NSD story. I was there for a piece of it. I think some folks on the call were there for longer chapters of it. At least when I was there, there was a sense that it was still figuring out some of its mandate, right? And again, there's a complicated relationship not just between NSD and the U.S. Attorney's offices, but sort of all U.S. Attorney's offices in some respects, and Main Justice. So you have that dynamic. You certainly have the dynamic of classification and overclassification, which can present real challenges, right? We do all of this work, in the name of the people. Classification is required in certain instances, and then in certain instances there's overclassification. And anybody, I think, who's ever held a clearance would say, we would generally agree with that, would be open to that interpretation, I would say. Going back to what David said, as a general statement, and this is not just DOJ, you could say this for a lot of institutions of government, right? The public's view is low, right, of a lot of our institutions. But going back to 100 Center Street, and one or two of the things I learned there is that you want to see similarly situated people treated in the same way, right? Similarly situated defendants to be treated in a similar fashion. And I think to the closer you get to that norm, right, we're talking about norms here in some regard, then the institution is bolstered.
I want to turn a little bit to the future and ask a few questions about what we might expect. And one is a little offbeat, but I have to ask it because I am who I am, which is if Biden is president, I'm curious what will happen at Guantanamo or to Guantanamo. The New York Times reporter and Pulitzer Center reporter Carol Rosenberg has been told by the Biden campaign that Mr. Biden continues to support closing the detention center. Josh, you were there when Obama tried to close the detention center. The plan is probably still on paper. You think that's possible, that Biden could do this, or is this a non-starter?
I hope it's possible, but it will take a change in political will in Congress. As you were kind enough to say, Karen, I put a lot of hours alongside many other people in trying to first, reduce the detainee population as much as possible, consistent with security and humane treatment obligations, and then to develop a plan that was presented in early 2016 to Congress of what comprehensive closure would look like. And it would involve those who are going through the military justice system, continuing to go through that system, slow as it has been, extraordinarily slow as it has been, those for whom criminal prosecution in the civilian courts might still be a possibility to have that go forward. And to the extent there's still some number of detainees, those final ones being held under the law of war on US soil, a step that not everyone likes, but that frankly would be the only feasible path to closure. But even that wasn't feasible in the political sense. It's feasible in the logistical and legal sense, but not the political sense, because to do those things, in fact, to bring any detainee to US soil would require a change in law that only Congress can provide. And it would take a willingness to acknowledge that those sorts of individuals can be held securely on US soil the way some extraordinarily dangerous people are already held securely on US soil at wildly lower cost to the taxpayer each year than the cost of each of the now 40 detainees at Guantanamo. So it strikes me as very much a political problem at this point, that yes, there's legal complexity. There's even logistical complexity in terms of what the facilities would need to look like. But the biggest obstacle right now is the politics on Capitol Hill.
So just to follow up there with you, Josh, do you have any, or does anyone you know have any sense that this is something that would matter to President Biden?
All I can say is this, is that he was part of an administration that put a tremendous amount of effort into this in the 8 years of Obama-Biden, in which there was from day one a focus on this. This was famously a day one executive order, even if closure didn't happen on the timetable that was hoped for then. But the work didn't stop, and folks worked, really right to the end. In fact, there were some detainee transfers right at the very end, to the chagrin of President-elect Donald Trump. So the effort put in by that administration, the Obama-Biden administration on Guantanamo, was extraordinary. And I think it speaks to at least the effort made then to reduce that population as much as possible, and then to create at least a comprehensive pathway towards closing the facility if Congress would facilitate it.
David, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think it's going to be even harder politically, simply because troubles in my business and the media. And then, I think we have the greatest crisis of disinformation, I think, in US history, i.e. the web has just grown even more important. So anyone who wants to argue to close Guantanamo, there's going to be more false information online about the danger each of those 40 detainees represents. We're living in two sort of different realities, and again, it's not just President Trump. And so I think Congress has been a huge problem here in all these issues we're talking about, the need for new legislation across the board, from Guantanamo to cybercrime to privacy. So I'm hoping the election will be cathartic. I hope, frankly, one of the two wins decisively. I hope people accept the results. That's the goal of our democracy, right? Blow off steam and have a new consensus theoretically every 4 years. But, you know, the pandemic shows us we're having trouble as a country and a society agreeing on basic facts. You know, how many people are dying? Do you need to wear a mask or not? So I think closing Guantanamo will be even harder.
So then my question to each one of you is, I always think Guantanamo is going to close, by the way, just so you know, I'm hopeful about it. But my question to all of you is, in a Biden administration, do you have a sense of who might be a candidate for Attorney General? Very quiet.
I can't say I do. I will say this about how Biden has talked about the Justice Department, and I have loved what he said, especially in the following respect. He's been asked this question in a couple different permutations of, well, what approach would you take to potentially investigating and prosecuting this? Or how would you go at that? And he has said some variant of, I look forward to having nothing direct to do with it and to leaving that work in the hands of the Justice Department. And that strikes me as such the right answer and such a return to norms. And again, those norms have been broken before. And as David's book articulates so well, and as he's saying in the course of this conversation, there are trends here. We can't treat the Donald Trump era or the Barr Justice Department as just popping up without a basis in trends in the public and trends in disinformation, trends in politics. There's a story behind all of this that won't go away whenever it is that the Trump administration comes to an end. But the idea of a president who says Justice Department calls on investigation and prosecution are the realm of the Justice Department, I love every time I hear that answer from him.
And do you think that's possible? I mean, it's not like there's been such daylight between any of the presidents and their attorney generals in recent history. Do you really think that's possible?
Excuse me. Go ahead, Josh.
Well, I do very much think that's possible. I mean, I don't want to overstate it. You know, sometimes people refer to a no contacts policy between the White House and the Justice Department. That's a misnomer. It's a policy of restricted contacts for particular reasons through particular channels. It would make no sense to have a no contacts policy. Let me give you an example. If you're about to arrest a high profile terrorism suspect, you want the rest of the national security apparatus of the government to know that, because this could lead to attacks on embassies. This could lead to attacks on US soil, military bases. It would be foolish not to have some people know about it. But you have to have a particular reason. You have to do it through the right channels. And similarly, prosecutions in the cyber realm, economic espionage, that can have huge diplomatic ramifications for partners if, in fact, the defendants are, for example, members of the Chinese PLA, which, of course, has happened. It would be foolish not to coordinate that. But there has to be a reason, and there has to be a responsible way of doing it. And by and large, this should be left to the Justice Department. It's only those particular complex incidents, reasons, arrests, cases, whatever it might be, that leads to more of a back and forth between the White House. Because the White House is basically the home of politics. And the Justice Department, sure, it has political leadership, but we want it to be a lot more law than politics there, ultimately.
David, you were going to weigh
quickly,
in?
I would love to see a Republican federal judge from Missouri, a person like William Webster, who was chosen to be FBI director, you know, not political, not a major figure in the Obama administration, to restore confidence in the Justice Department. I think my last spiel, you know, at that time in the 70s, Levy, Webster, Church, John Tower, the Republican on the Church Committee, that generation faced the exact same crisis of legitimacy we faced. They enacted reforms that restored credibility, you know, to the Justice Department, you know, and our government evolved. And I think that's the kind of bold, nonpartisan appointment that needs to be made to restore confidence in the Justice Department, including the National Security Division.
Josh Larocca, thoughts about the future?
Yeah, you know, I'm going back to something that David said that really caught my mind a minute ago. Again, going back to just pure sort of national security thinking, which is a lot of things, Karen, and this is, I think, especially true to the work that you've done and the work at the center, right? A lot of questions that I think were sort of top of mind. We were talking about Guantanamo, we were talking about a lot of the issues there, in some regards have become settled in the sense that they've been fully briefed, right? Everybody knows what the positions are, everybody knows what the issues are, right? And I think Josh Geltzer, maybe this is sort of what you were saying a little bit, right? I mean, you know, if you're following national security in this country, I mean, regardless of what side you're on, you know what the issues are with regard to Guantanamo, right? And terrorism prosecutions, let's say more generally. You know what those issues are. David, what you said, which I found particularly interesting, is how do you translate those issues, which, and again, if you use my loose terminology, are settled, you know, generally speaking, to the way we talk about things, to the way information is shared, to the way that you know, we think about the threat environment, right? Which you know, has changed dramatically. Again, you know, specifically thinking about certain cyber threats. And so to me, that's interesting, is like, how do those issues or those conversations sort of get updated to the moment that we're in? And I don't know, you know, the answer to that, but it's given me something to think about, right? Which is, again, how do we think about the moment we're in and these issues, you know, with regard to national security? And I think that to me is good food for thought.
And maybe we should think about the moment we're going to be in as well, because it seems to me that every time we think about something where things are moving so fast, changes are moving so fast, potential threats are moving so fast, as we discovered with COVID. So, you know, part of that becomes sort of guessing, particularly in the national security sphere, but not only. So we're coming to the end of our time, or we're at the end of our time, but, you know, we always end center events with a question, which is, what gives you hope that we're gonna work this all out? David, I'm gonna start with you.
I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of national security for a political consensus about privacy and surveillance. I think the far left and the far right, you have the funny alliance, you may not like either of them, between Ron Wyden, the liberal from Oregon, and Rand Paul, the libertarian from Kentucky. So I think that's an opportunity. If there's workable solutions or being more transparent, again, pie in the sky, you know, I'm optimistic. Past generations have faced these kind of crises of legitimacy. If we're transparent and we enact reforms and we go with nonpartisanship, you know, I think we can come out of this stronger. So I'm optimistic. Not all the time, but I'm optimistic.
Nonpartisanship is what I'm taking away in part from that. That's interesting. Josh Larocca, how about you?
I agree. I'm optimistic as well. I mean, you know, I'll end where I started, which is, you know, some faith in the institutional government that we have in this country. You know, that's my experience. You know, that's what I bring to the table for this discussion. And, you know, just having seen it up front, right? Folks of all backgrounds, stripes, you know, coming to the table to do their job. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine who had a long career in government, and he said, you know, most people, they get up, they go to the office, a task is put in front of them, they try to do the best job they can, and they're worried about their kids and their mortgage and you know, what they're doing that weekend. And you know, I think that's a very important tradition we have here, that people are you know, going to you know, their career positions and doing the best they can.
So that kind of raises something else, which is how much has the COVID age, and it's our sitting at home watching the world and not having the regularity of our lives that you just referred to, made us focus on things maybe in a more anxiety-ridden way than we might otherwise have done. I mean, talk about changes. This is a very changed environment from which to view the world outside of your protected home or your protected space, whether it includes home and work. Okay, the final word of hope from you, Joshua Geltzer.
If you'll let me get away with it, Karen, I want to say two, because I feel like I've done my fair share of doom and gloom. But the first one really just goes back to a point Josh began us talking about, and he has, I think, quite rightly emphasized throughout this conversation, which is the backbone of our government. For all we talk about the politicals, for all the good or damage the politicals can do, the backbone are the civil servants, the public servants, the military officers, the intelligence officers. And this is going to sound like a funny thing to find good news in, but the arrest and charges brought against Steve Bannon, I don't have particular glee or lack thereof in seeing Steve Bannon charged, But think about that. People had to work hours, days, weeks at the investigatory level, at the legal level, knowing that they were going to roll out charges against Steve Bannon. They've seen what's happened to other people, even line prosecutors who've worked on cases targeting close associates of President Trump, people who've been overruled, who've been forced off cases, who've resigned from the department, and they still did that work. They still followed those investigatory leads. They still rolled out those charges. So it's not Bannon getting charged that encourages me, is that people did exactly what Josh was just talking about. They went and they did their jobs in a fierce and fraught political environment because that's what they signed up to do. And that, I thought, was the most important part of that story, and yet really an overlooked one. The other thing that gives me hope is that people are talking about the law in ways they didn't used to. Now, to have to talk about the Hatch Act a lot during a party's national convention is probably a sign that something bad has happened, but they're talking about the Hatch Act, right? They're talking about what it means and why we have, in that case, ethics, law and policy to act as guardrails. And if that conversation about the Hatch Act or the Impoundment Act during the impeachment process, if those conversations speak to a thirst for law in the sense, and to understand the rule of law, and to recommit ourselves in the areas that we need to as a country to the rule of law, I think that's good news.
I think you kind of nailed it. There is an awful lot of attention to the law, and I think there's awful lot of questioning of how firm can the law hold. And so yes, we should all be hopeful with you that in the end result, it looks like it looks just and fair. But I think, right now we're in some kind of turmoil over that. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for this conversation. I will have you back after the election. Then we're going to really talk. And then you'll tell me who should be AG, right? So start working on it now. Thank you all in the audience for joining. If you want to know about our future events this semester, which are many, check us out on centeronnationalsecurity.org, where you can see our full list of events, our daily and weekly publications, our podcasts, our online forums, and whatever else is there on the site that might interest you. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you next time.